Welcome, and thank you, Dr. Vandana Shiva, Michel Bauwens, and Pedro Tarak for joining us in this insightful conversation. Dr. Vandana Shiva, you're in India and you're a world-known scholar and environmental activist, particularly known for your fight against Monsanto. Michel Bauwens, calling in from Thailand, your global recognition is on your work on the commons and peer-to-peer. And Pedro Tarak, in Argentina, you have co-founded various organizations, including the B Corps of South America, Sistema B. Today is part of a project called Bridging Foundations for a Liveable Future, which gave birth during lockdown. We were seeing the crisis in health unfold and upcoming economical crisis, climate change crisis, and we were seeing the relations. And we wanted to do something. We wanted to offer everyone an improved understanding of what is happening and what is possible. So we wanted to bring people together in open conversation to cross-pollinate ideas, share insights that lead to action. So thank you once again for being here. I would like to start with Dr. Vandana Shiva. You have a PhD in the Foundations on Quantum Theory in the University of Western Ontario. And you have received numerous awards for your services on the earth, the protection of biodiversity, and people's rights. So, Ms. Vandana, I would like to invite you perhaps now to present yourself a little bit. And through that, I would like to, ask your question of what are the key activities that you're involved in today that you feel are relevant to the world?
So as you've already mentioned, I did my PhD in the Foundations of Quantum Theory. I did my MSc in particle physics. But I got involved even then with an amazing movement, joyful movement, where women of my region, from the villages, came out and said, we will not let you cut the forests. The movement was called Chipko, which means to hug. And they hugged the trees and said, you'll have to kill us before you kill the trees. And this movement that started in the 70s went down all the way till 81, when we actually managed to get a logging ban, because what the women were saying, these are not timber mines. These are sources of our food and our water and our soil and our pure air. These are the basis of our economy. And it's only when there was a flood in 1978 that the government realized that the tiny bits of revenue they were getting from logging operations shrank into nothing compared to the flood relief they had to look at. And they realized what the women were saying was right. And I decided that even though I was studying in Canada, I would come back every vacation, summer, winter, and volunteer for this movement. So I went to the University of Western Ontario for my Foundations of Quantum Theory. But I went to my own mountains in the Himalaya, which is where I'm born, which is where I'm locked down in Dehradun, for my PhD in ecology and ecological activism. And this taught me about biodiversity, because at that time, no one was telling you about the value of diversity. University, we were in an hierarchy. Physics is the top, then there's chemistry, then there's biology. Of course, I wanted to be on the top. But I learned biology and ecology from the women who learned it from living in the forest. This threw me in to understand why agriculture had gone so wrong. I was working for the United Nations University on a program on conflicts over resources. And in 84, the place where I had studied, Punjab, erupted in violence. And this is where the Green Revolution was first introduced. Was not green, it was not revolutionary, it was really global agribusiness trying to capture Indian agriculture to sell chemicals. And that same year in the city of Bhopal, there was the disaster that killed thousands. So I did my studies on the Green Revolution, chemical farming, wrote a book called The Violence of the Green Revolution for the United Nations, and realized then that this was not farming. This was extending the war that had started in the concentration camps of Hitler to continue to sell those chemicals that were designed to kill people, now with the excuse that they're going to kill insects and weeds like Roundup. So I then said, I'm going to promote a non-violent farming, a regenerative farming. And 87 was thrown into a meeting where the big poison cartel is saying, now we'll own the seed. We'll do genetic engineering. This way we can take a patent. Farmers won't be able to save their seeds. And we'll get an international treaty in the GATT and WTO on intellectual property to own the seed. I was at this meeting in 87. I said, but you don't make the seed. You don't create a seed. The seed is evolution. So since 87, I've been saving seeds. I've been promoting, practicing regenerative agriculture. And we can later talk about how chemical farming invented a very fraudulent scientific paradigm that doesn't tell you anything about what's happening, but it has constructs that make you have the illusion that you're growing more food, the yields are higher, and in the process, we have 1 billion people starving. So my joy of life is I take care of seeds now. I protect some biodiversity. The earth protects the rest of biodiversity, because when you do the right thing with your right actions aligned with the laws of the earth, without the true ecological scientific laws, then amazing things start to happen.
The factories that were producing the fertilizers are the same factories that before they were producing fertilizers and the other chemicals were actually also producing the chemicals that were initiated during the Second World War. So that's the link that you are explaining indeed about the Second World War. After the war, the factories were there, the chemicals were being produced, and people found other applications for them, and therefore, needed to grow the market because the market is indeed there, that needs to be developed, and a financial international system that needs to be developed. So we went from the Green Revolution to farming, to the impact of farming on the ground, because you've always, even though are focusing very much on the big picture, are also very much connected with the day-to-day, with what happens with local farmers. There are a lot of small-size farmers that are providing the food in the world for us today. Is that right?
Well, 80% of the food we eat comes from small farms. Mm-hmm. These occupy only 20-25% of the land.
Yes.
Whereas the industrial farms that occupy large amounts of the land only provide 20% of the food. And the crops that have been expanding most rapidly in the last 30 years of neoliberal globalization are GMO corn and GMO soya. 90% of the corn and soya goes for biofuel and animal feed, for the hunger of the cow and factory feeding of animals. Only 10% goes for food. So that's why this is not a food system, and that's why there's hunger. So if you look at what it's doing, it's destroying the planet. Even I've run a piece on ecological reflections on the coronavirus when this all started, that it's the invasions into forest ecosystems by agribusiness to grow commodity crops that has created infectious diseases where animals which were safe in their habitat and the viruses on them were safe on the animals now become infectious diseases. And corona is only one of them. There's Ebola, there's HIV, there's MERS, there's the Nile virus, there's Zika virus. The names carry on 300 new diseases created by invasions into forests because of an agribusiness that is very, very inefficient. So it uses huge amounts of land. It's destroyed 93% biodiversity. It's desertified the land. It's creating infectious diseases and chronic diseases. So no matter what indicator you look at in a scientific way, it's a failed system. And it's only propped up by two things: our tax money as subsidies and government policies, because governments get captured. And so I'm very happy that Europe has just passed, even though it's not enough, but it has passed a new farm to fork policy.
Yes.
Saying in 10 years, we want 50% reduction in pesticide. I would like to see 100% reduction by 2030, because we don't need these poisons. And with the levels of unemployment that's created out of the coronavirus, I think it's time to say, let anyone who wants to farm get the land. So much land is being laid waste. Let people and land come together for regeneration. That is our global agenda.
Yes, yes. Global agenda, global topics, complexity because of the relationships of the way that we see the world is built up today, which is a market economy, which has policies and legislation. And these are very big and very challenging topics that are very, very interrelated. So I would like to take the opportunity also to move on and to ask and to introduce briefly Michel Bauwens and pass on the word to him. So Michel Bauwens, you are the founder of the Peer-to-Peer Foundation, and you're working in collaboration with the exploration of peer production, governance, and property. So you'll be telling us a little bit more of what that is. You are also the research director of the commonstransitions.org. Basically, the work that you do summarizes in understanding peer-to-peer and understanding the commons in a historical point of view as well. So,
yes, so it's,
yes.
It's a few things that come together. So the first thing about my work is that certainly if you live in a Western country, the two things that are talked about and exist as choices is the market versus the state. So there is no question of commoning the commons. Civil society is something you do, when you're tired and you come home and you volunteer for an NGO. But there's no sense in our countries that there's another human institution than either the market or the state. So for 200 years, we've been, what Karl Polanyi calls a double movement. We go into deregulation, privatization, and then we exaggerate in these so-called free markets, and then the state reintroduces top-down measures for a better redistribution. But we always move between those two polarities. And what we've forgotten is that there's another institution that historically is the only one that has been able to manage resources sustainably, which is the institution of the commons. Traditionally, at least the school that I'm following, we have a triple definition. One is a shared resource. And now I know nowadays the word resource is a bit questioned because it kind of implies a division between humans and nature. But let's say there's something that needs to be shared. That's very important. And second, it's an activity. So it's there's a historian, Peter Leinbauer, that says there's no commons without commoning. So that stresses the point that the commons is a choice. It's something that you can do as a human group with a resource. It's not given by nature. It's a choice of humanity to have a particular relationship with resources and other living beings. And then the third aspect of the commons is this requirement for self-regulation. So the regulation of the commons cannot be a private market-based, and cannot be state-based regulation. These norms have to come from the people themselves who are doing this activity together. And maybe briefly, it's a bit of a Western-centric history, but I think that's where I come from. So that's kind of my life experience. Is that certainly in the West, the commons have been really completely disappeared. I mean, they still exist to a certain degree, but they're not a conscious part of societal life in our countries. And so you have to imagine that capitalism, when it started growing in Europe in the 16th century, was a machine to destroy the commons. So the natural resources, which were the first commons, were pretty much completely destroyed. And so the second wave we had was the workers' movement. So this was all the farmers that were excluded from their land and had to come to the cities as workers, where they were dying 30 years on average in the 1850s. Just as an anecdote, I was reading this recently. So in Lille, there were 20,000 workers in 1830.
This is a city in the northern France.
In northern France. They didn't have housing. They lived in caves. There were 10,000 children born to them in 1830. And their one doctor for 20,000 miners recorded that after 10 years, only 600 of these children were still alive. So that gives you an idea of the enormous destructive force of industrialization in the beginning of the 19th century. And so the second form of commons is really what the labor movement did to mutualize social risk, because that's what commoning is about. Commoning is mutualization. And so everything that we have in the welfare state, and people tend to forget that, was invented as a social commons by the workers who were trying to, socialize their risk because they had no protection.
So some very clear examples of a social common.
Well, if we have Social Security, for example, that was invented by the labor movement. That was not an invention by the state. If you think about the New Deal, it was an invention of Roosevelt. He actually looked at what the workers' movement was already doing in the US at that time. Same with the English system, with the NHS and I think it's Beveridge, who was the politician in the 40s. He took a system that already existed that workers had invented in Wales. So what we call the welfare state is a statification of the commons, of the social commons of the working class.
You have very clearly the state with activities and legislation and organizations put in place. Then you also have business and companies working in a particular market, and the commons is a third group.
It's a third group whenever citizens are freely associating and creating their own initiatives outside of both the market and the state, then you can say that they're most likely doing a commons oriented activity.
Yes.
And so if you follow my history so far, so you have a privatization of the natural resource commons, you have a statification of the social commons, and so that was kind of like killing the commons in a way in the West. And then what brought it back to life for us was really the open source movement. So unlike India, we only have 2% farmers left in our countries, and there's just no land. There's no available land today, even for a young farmer to buy land. It's practically impossible. So now we're working on community land trusts and on other strategies. But so this being aside, the real commons when they came back to us were actually the open source commons. So the capacity of people to share knowledge and to use that knowledge to do things together. So that gave us free software, that gave us open design, that gives a number of things that brought back the idea of the commons in Western society. And of course, then we rediscovered the fact that in the global South, the commons never disappeared. I mean, they're under attack and they're diminishing, but they're basically still a huge part of daily life. Like in Africa, it's still 80% of the land is still commonly owned, for example. Now, the last phase that I want to briefly explain, because I think that's important for the people who listen to this, is that we are slowly also getting to real production. So it's not just about mutualizing knowledge, it's actually about reorganizing provisioning systems. So one of the studies I did was in Ghent in 2016. And we saw that we went from 50 urban commons in 2006 to 500 in 2016. So that's a tenfold increase of people taking charge of their own provisioning systems. For example, around food is a good example. In any city in Europe, you will now find hundreds of collective purchasing groups, right? So these are groups of confused consumers allying themselves with groups of farmers. So you could say it's a market, but actually the ecosystem is a commons. So they're deciding to have an organic food system where there is solidarity between the buyers and the producers. So it's one ecosystem. It's no longer kind of a power struggle between supply and demand. It's one integrated system which recognizes the needs of everyone in that ecosystem. And so you see that, for example, in renewable energy, where 60% of the renewable energy in Germany is now actually produced by mostly village co-ops. So people in the village getting together to take care of their energy provisioning. And so this is a real explosion since about 2008. It's one of the reactions that people have against crisis. And so just to finish with one more thing, because we're in the COVID period. So there is now an enormous global mobilization of maker movements. So people who decide to make the stuff that neither the market and the state were able to do. So we're talking about masks, about ventilators, valves, even doorknobs. I mean, everything that you can imagine, and which amazingly Western hospitals don't have. Because of the neoliberal destruction of the public infrastructure, there is now this enormous move by these communities to find alternatives. So that was, I just wanted to stretch a bit the history of how this is evolving.
Yes, indeed. I was going to add the example of the masks and other products that are very quickly created from a Western point of view. As you rightly say, the commons was almost forgotten, and to see the initiatives being taken place of Fab Labs and other individuals, not only producing masks, but also ventilators that are quite more technical, and they have to be very safe. For processes to be put in place very quickly to do that is something that in a Western world would not have been imagined possible only 1 year ago or 6 months ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that probably in other countries is initiatives that may have much quicker responses and much quicker activity. So what I think is really so valuable, so important with the work that you do, both Michel and Vandana, that you have explained, is explaining phenomena that are there, explaining problems that are there, and giving a clear name to it. Because the commons have been there. As you say, we discover that they have been so much bigger in other continents beyond the Western world, is to put names to them, to explain them, and to provide insights, because very often the way the world is today, with the industry as it is today, with the economy as it is today, we think it's the only way possible, and indeed it is not, and that to me would be the biggest message. So yes, thank you.
Well, I just want to show this to Michel. So in '87, I started to save seeds. But over the next decade, I was also working on articulating, reclaiming the seed and biological diversity and our knowledge as a commons. And I wrote this, Enclosure and Recovery of the Commons, in '97, to brief our parliament on keeping our biodiversity, knowledge and seed in the commons. And it made a difference to India's laws. So our seeds are not patented. And the issue of commons is something I would love to discuss much, much more.
It's a great achievement, because now the big fight is over the vaccines, and if the vaccine is privatized, and let's assume it's a good vaccine, Trump was trying to make sure that they would only be produced in the United States first. So this is what happened with AIDS, because the patenting of the medicines, for years, millions of people were dying because they had to pay thousands of dollars that they could not afford, whereas the actual production price of these medications was just a few tens of dollars. I think it was about $120, the real cost of making them. So people were being killed because of privatization of knowledge, and people. I mean, so it's great in India, because I know from Indonesia and Malawi and other countries where farmers are put in prison for the mere fact of sharing seeds. And for example, if you buy a tractor today from John Deere, you are not allowed to repair it because the software is patented. So this is a terrible idea, to privatize knowledge in that way.
Yes.
And can I just follow up on that? 14 patents for a fake Impossible Burger. 14 patents. 100 more for fake food. And who has the biggest investments in it? Our dear Bill Gates. So they don't want a commons because they don't want people to be able to take care of each other and the earth. And any extractive system must rupture the commons, break community, make people dependent, and therefore I believe the recovery of the commons is probably the only way to deal with an extractive economy that has no way to provide the needs of the people.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
we're totally
Wonderful.
aligned on this.
Yes, I think it's very important to really understand these facts and understand the reality. And then the question arises what to do with it and how to respond. And you are responding to this in your own way. And I also would like to, introduce Pedro Tarak to the conversation, who also is responding in his own way. So Pedro, you are a lawyer. You are specialized in environmental rights. You co-founded in '84 the Fundación Ambiente y Recursos Naturales. So it's the foundation for the environment and natural resources in Argentina. So you're based in Argentina. And you're also a co-founder of Sistema B, an organization dedicated to promoting the B Corps in South America. So this is also another of your activities. So as a person that is very much familiar with the law and with institutions that also produce the examples that Michel and Vandana are sharing, what would you like to bring in the conversation? What is your take on it?
You know what, Camila, I used to be a lawyer, and that was about almost 30 years ago. And I actually focused on environmental law in times where we needed to actually bring the awareness of the needs for life of everybody, of all life systems, into the cultural and political systems. That's what I used to do. And building regimes, water protection regimes, biodiversity regimes, air pollution controlling, and so on. Many of those legislations are there, and they're part of Latin American legal regimes. But I would say that about after the Earth Summit in 1992, I started sort of dismantling my own mindset and starting to think that the way the law was built was in silos. It actually justified the political and economic systems with which I was not, satisfied. And I started realizing that we needed to challenge the fundamentals of politics and the fundamentals of the economic system. That was when I started to help basically a philanthropic organization in Latin America. And that's where I started meeting directly about 20 years ago, the leadership in indigenous communities and campesino communities, but also in all kinds of domains. And it was in 1997 that I realized, going back to the commons, that Andean indigenous communities had a completely different understanding of the market and of the market dynamics, of what business meant. So I was with a lady, Doña Rosario Quispe. She's my master, if you want. She was my true teacher. And, I asked her, how do you actually start and build your companies, your businesses? And she said very clear, we listen to the voices, to the common voices. Then we ask if the idea that we have is resonant with the communities. And then if it is, then we will actually do business that starts from the ground, it could be farming, but it could be other stuff as well. It starts from the earth, and then it responds back to people. And whatever we do that is a surplus goes back into the community. And also, if it's a waste, it goes back to the Pachamama, back to the earth. That triggered the big challenge in what I had learned about business. And I would say that what I do today, basically, is to find the mutation points of the economic system and to see if we can evolve from just thinking on profit making into value creation. And by value creation, I mean all kinds of value, starting from cultural value creation. I would say retrieving the cultural values, the cultural traditions, the practices, and connecting that with social value creation, environmental value creation, and of course economic value creation, but as an integrated value creation notion. And that was when I got together with some friends who had started a company in South America called Guayaki, which is based on the yerba mate, which is a plant, sorry, it's a tree, but it has a leaf that is, if you want, an alternative to coffee. And so it boosts you up. And that's a tradition that we've inherited from the Guarani cultures in South America. And it's produced in southern Brazil, in Paraguay, in Argentina. The culture of the yerba mate is to have conversations in circles. It's a trust building tradition, quality conversations, building the common understanding. You have a gourd, you have someone who's called the cebador, who's the person who takes care of everybody else and serves each person the turn of the mate. So Guayaki was born as a company, as just like any other company, to actually bring back the culture of the mate, but at the same time responding to a big problem. And the problem was that the yerba mate is actually a native tree in what used to be the second largest rainforest in South America after the Amazon, called the South Atlantic Forest. In Portuguese, it's Mata Atlântica, and in Spanish is Selva Misionera. You know what? When the company was started, there was only 7.8% left for the reasons that Vandana was mentioning. Monoculture, mostly soya bean and some other commodities, but also pine and eucalyptus. And of course, people who relied on that forest were not there any longer. They had gone to the slums of the cities in the area. So the purpose of this company, Guayaki, is as the forest went back, is to return back the forest, but also the sense of community that has been dismantled because lots of people have gone to slums and have actually lost their connections with their origin. So what Guayaki does basically is the putting into the market the opportunity for consumers, for investors, for collaborators to connect with the people who are the harvesters, who are the owners of their land, who earn from 40 to 60% more than the market value for the leaves, as long as they harvest the leaves from standing trees. As a result, there are almost 200,000 acres that have been regenerated, above 1,000 family members who are back into the community with living wages. And as investors, in 6 years' time, I can tell you, it's 600% increase in the share value.
With the example you're giving of a company that started to look beyond, that started to act not only as a company, but also in terms of governance, be much more interactive with the people that the company employs, with the people that surround the company and that consume the product, because mate is this drink that is typically from Argentina and the region as well. That is not only a product bought and consumed, but is also part of the heritage and the cultural heritage of that southern part of Latin America. So from a point of view of a company, what would be the key lessons, the key lesson that you would offer other companies learning from what you have been able to achieve?
In order to have a public purpose for a company, it's crucial, at least in my view, to have three elements. One, to elevate the purpose of the companies. You can't have profit as the purpose through an activity. It's elevating the purpose to a solution, to a societal, environmental solution, and a solution which is good in the short and in the long term as well. That solution needs to become part of the core business and be protected in the mission statement of the articles of incorporation. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult to be safe in the kind of capitalism world that we have today. A second element is that we need to count in all dimensions of a company, not only financially, but with the same rigor. And that's the reason for which the B Corps as such are subject to a third-party independent scrutiny where you're measured in 5 areas. Your relationship with the collaborators or workers, your relationship with the clients, your relationship with all stakeholders in the communities with which you relate, among which you have the suppliers, the environment, and of course, there's a different governance system.
Yes, yes, indeed. These are initiatives that are very important to reconnect. It's a way of sort of reconnecting humanity into our economy, into our society, that each of the speakers today are doing themselves. My question that I would ask all three of you is, we are now 2 months into this health crisis. To some of us, it's also already, at least here in France, it's feeling as if we're coming out of it, as if we're going back to normal. Back to normal is getting the kids back to school. It's getting your job back again. It's it's very pragmatic things. It's working your mortgage up again. Things that may not necessarily have changed during this crisis, but this crisis has made a lot of turbulence for a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of people's livelihood. And here I'm looking at the big picture. I'm looking, from the world picture.
But, I think if we are awake and we know what's going on, we should know that there are very powerful interests who have clear ideas about another economy, a new economy which doesn't need people. So as the ILO has shown, that the lockdown has made 1.9 billion people lose their livelihoods, of the 3.3 billion working people in the world.
On a global scale.
Yeah. So we are talking of half of the working people. Yeah. And the working people doesn't mean working for someone else. It could be a cafe owner, a bar owner, a bakery. They have all suffered. And as I mentioned, Silicon Valley is ready to bring you totally fake food. For them, this is an opportunity that the food systems, not there. This is where the lessons we need to learn include creating local food systems, reclaiming the commons of the seed of food, of our knowledge of how to grow real food. I think among the lessons, that will be natural to people. One will be people will have realized that you can do with less, because lockdown meant you weren't shopping all the time. And that, I think, is very important because the lubrication of the money machine is really through people lending themselves to be consumers and stopping being makers. Yeah. So if we aren't consumers of junk clothing, there will be no junk clothing. If we are consumers of junk food, there won't be junk food. If we are not consumers of fake food, and we realize we have the knowledge of eating being the basis of our health, this is the one thing that's not being talked about in the COVID crisis, in the medical side, even though the real doctors are talking about immunity, are talking about risks go up with the COVID infection if you have diabetes, if you have problems because of pollution, if you have cancer, if you have heart problems. The data is all there. In America, doctors were being paid extra to mark every death as a COVID death, rather than let the complexity of a bad food system show up in a naked way in evidence of what this health emergency has actually done. So if I was to say so there's a new normal being planned by the big technology. It's the Amazons who don't want any neighborhood shops. They don't want it at all. And during the corona epidemic, they gained because everyone was doing online orders. Jeff Bezos increased his wealth, personal wealth, by $34 billion in the 1 month of lockdown, while small shops, bakeries, bars lost their livelihoods. And we don't know how many of them will be able to come back. And they won't unless we reclaim that commons of our neighborhood, of our cultural systems. Bill Gates is very, very clear. I mean, if you look at the agreement that Cuomo, the governor of New York, has signed, with Schmidt, who's the chair of Google, and Bill Gates, they basically want no one ever to go back to work. They want children to continue to look at computers as if there's nothing else you learn. You don't learn how to take care of each other. You don't know how to play games. You don't learn how to grow a garden. Oh, no. You're going to learn from this machine. And because you could get distracted with the boredom of a lesson on a machine, they're talking about spyware on children to make sure they're monitoring their attention. So they're talking about schools being a waste. Here's this real estate. They're talking about working from home as the, so, my two things about the COVID crisis is, if it's a health emergency, any epidemic ends. Any measure you put to manage the health emergency should be frozen and removed after the emergency is passed. But if what you're planning through this health emergency is a whole new totalitarian economy, in which the tech giants say we don't need 90% of the people. And in India, half of the working people were just thrown on the streets. They're walking back to their villages with pain. And what I'm doing, and I was doing it just before our call started, I'm working with our communities to say we worked on saving seeds, we worked on regenerative agriculture. Now let us welcome back the dispossessed and create economies where instead of intensifying fossil fuels, we intensify people's work and creativity and solidarity. If fossil fuels created a misdefinition of productivity, it was by counting how many hands you threw away as higher productivity. So the fewer farmers, the more productive your agriculture. Now, biomass debates are talking about farming without farmers, digital agriculture. They don't want farmers. But good farming needs farmers. Good farming needs care. Care needs people. And you can be careless with fossil fuels and poisons, but ecological farming and regenerative agriculture needs care. Care needs head and heart and hand. And these are the transitions we have to be getting rid of with the full knowledge that in my experience, both of study of colonialism, my experience of the Green Revolution, my experience of the GMO issue, is none of this greed economy evolves the greed system while the good systems of solidarity and the commons carry on, because they know if the commons are there, who'll turn to their junk. So they have to make the commons illegal. That's what they tried to make illegal for saving seeds. They have to make good food illegal through all kinds of tricks. They will try, and we have to be ready. And that's why, for me, a very important part of defending the commons, beginning from the Chipko movement, beginning with our independence movement, is the power of not cooperating. My book, there's a book in French on creative civil disobedience, on my belief in non-cooperation against unjust laws that destroy the earth, destroy people's livelihood, destroy democracy. We then have an obligation to obey the higher laws of the earth, of humanity, of our freedom, to say no. And before I wrap up here, I want to say, so, it's very easy to dismiss and say this totalitarian system is just an imagination. It's not. I've analyzed this patent. It's patent number, World Patent 2020-060606. It's basically turning human beings into a mine, to mine data, our bodily data, our blood pressure, our brain activity, suck it into the system, into the server through algorithms. They then assess our value and define our value. Earlier it was left to the market. Now this cryptocurrency and digital dictatorship will define what cryptocurrency they assign to us. So if you have a home and they will assign you a value that doesn't allow you to have that home will go. So they're going to use the digital dictatorship to alienate more land, alienate more businesses, alienate more. This is where we have to not just defend what we have and reclaim the commons of today. We have to defend the commons from this future, because this is an end to humanity. This is an end to freedom. We have been reduced to users. We are no more human beings. We are minds of data and users of machines. We have no other status in this world. And this, to me, is really, and I've done a piece on it. It's my message for World Biodiversity Day. It's available on, or not just on my Navdanya website. But I think we need to, both look at history and the enclosures of the commons. We need to look at the present and where our creative solidarities can regenerate the earth and economy. We need to look into the future. What is it within our existing systems that we can do to prevent this horror of 90% useless, 10% digital slaves? Not a livable future. This is not a livable future, either for the throwaway people or the slaves. We need freedom. And commons can only be built when people are free and communities can organize together.
Yes, strong words. Thank you, Vandana. The work that you're doing now and you have done in the past is you challenge the status quo. You challenge the things that are perceived normal, that people think, this is the way it is. And it seems to work, at least pre-COVID. This is what you challenge in a way that is easy and understandable for everyone, and also, quite specific, such as this patent. You bring home those aspects to our daily lives, as a citizen or as a consumer, that we have a choice in the lifestyle we make, the things that we buy, the crops that we choose to grow, the products we choose to sell. My question for the gentleman is, how can we further this in an easy way? What message would you have for the everyday woman or man today?
Answering directly by referring to my own question that I had sent you, which is about the value. And I just want to give an example of this. So you have three nurses. The first nurse works for the Congregation of Mother Teresa. She's supported by the community. She, in terms of capitalist value, she does not count. She's not recorded anywhere. This doesn't exist in the current value paradigm. Then you have a second nurse, and she works for a public hospital. And right now they're considered to be heroes, but by the system, she's considered as a cost. And one of the reasons that we have all these problems with COVID is that the public health infrastructure has been dismantled over time because it was too expensive. And then there's a third nurse, and she works for a private hospital, and she's contributing to the value creation of the shareholders, and she's in the positive ledger in GDP. So you can see that three people doing the same job are judged in an entirely different way. And so this is what I mean with the value regime. Why is this? Why is only one of these nurses put on a pedestal and recognized? And so this is a bit an answer to what Pedro explained, and maybe also Vandana, is today the only value that is recognized is extractive value. It's if you extract something to make it into a commodity, whether it's human labor or natural resources, that makes you wealthy. And then we go into tax and redistribute somehow, or we do philanthropy like Bill Gates, right? So, but that means that we have a fundamental problem. That is, if you do generative work, if you improve the soil as a farmer, you are basically not rewarded. And if you exploit the soil, then you're rewarded. So if you look at the figures, there's about 100 times more subsidies for industrial farming than for organic farming, and about 100 times more subsidies for fossil fuels and for renewable energy. And the kind of solutions, they're not obvious in that kind of very unequal situation, right? Where the power is all on one side. And so you get marginalized in a way if you want to do something good. So this is why I think that solutions like the one that is presented by Pedro are really interesting, because they kind of reform this idea where in a mission-oriented entity, profit is subsumed to the social ethical goal. So that's one of the things that we can do to rework the value. But I'm thinking of other systems, and maybe it's a bit controversial, but I'll just give an example of how this could work. So when I was working in Ghent, there was a project to use a public building
so
that
Ghent
was given to
Ghent is a
Ghent,
village in
city
Belgium.
in northern Belgium, in the Flanders. And so they were going to put a building as a free space for civil society. And they could have done this through competitive bidding, competitive procurement, in which case what happens is that the entity that externalizes as much as they can of costs to society and other entities, they will win the bid. And so what Ghent is, I think, is very original, and that's why I'd like to give this an example. This was called a call for common. And so what the city of Ghent decided at the point was to say, we'll give this project to those that can coalesce the largest number of civil society organizations, right? So this was rewarding cooperation instead of rewarding competition. So that's one possible solution that I think is interesting. And this general category, I call this public commons cooperation protocols. And this is something that we are lacking in our society. We have market and state, and the state is a market state that does everything to help the market, while it completely ignores what is happening in terms of generative value creation at the side of civil society. A good example of this is what happened in Bologna, where the Bologna regulation for the care and regeneration of the urban commons, which is now copied in 240 Italian cities, has allowed 1 million Italians to contribute to the urban commons. So in other words, there's now a procedure in Italy that allows any group of citizens to say, we want to care for that thing, like an empty factory and a dilapidated square, anything. And so this piece of legislation has enabled and empowered 1 million citizens to do something for their city, right? And for example, if you take COVID-19, it's the same problem. So all these people are mobilizing, these makers are mobilizing to do what the market didn't do, but there's no easy connection between both, right? And so actually in France, the public hospitals of the Île-de-France region, the capital region, were the first to actually create a process that would allow them to accept productions from civil society. So I'm just pointing out that so we can do a lot of things in civil society and in the commons, but as long as we have a hostile state that only works for capital, we are marginalized. So we always also need to, fight for legal transformations that create a level playing field. Like I think the B corporations is an example of a reform which creates a whole new wave of, potential work for the common good, which actually it's illegal otherwise. As you know, in some countries, if you do not enrich your shareholders, you can go to jail because it's a legal obligation to augment the financial capital of your corporation. So if you don't have the B corporations a legal reform, you cannot do it legally.
Traditionally, we have enterprises and companies producing things, and we have government also making financial decisions on spending that have always been very much predefined in a particular way, where there's no space for alternatives. It's either business, or it's philanthropy, or it's state, local or regional. And that's it. And with what you're highlighting with your examples, and that is represented with this concept of the commons, is that there is an alternative, and that it is possible, and that at some levels, for example, the city of Ghent in Belgium is actually opening up to doing policy and deciding on spending in an alternative way that is not only business driven in one particular way. Because it's not just that it's business driven according to those and those rules. So it's quite formatted, as we would say in the French language. It's very predefined. So to see that other possibilities are evolving is very important also to see, because it's not philanthropy. It's something more. Yes, Pedro.
Yeah, let me just give 3 examples of how we can elevate and scale up the whole logic and practice of the commons. 1, if government procurement awards a prime price to those companies that beyond product or services, beyond conditions of payment and value and price, that is a possibility for the government to stop becoming a mission-driven government. So, for example, in the case of the city of Mendoza in Argentina, they adopted a regulation that awards 5% for the local companies that actually change their DNA. And that means they elevate their purpose, they relocate profit behind the solutions, social and environmental solutions, and are subject to a third-party scrutiny on all of their impacts. And if a company is not from Mendoza, they award 3% additional price to the terms of reference of the bid. That was achieved thanks to citizen movements. So that's one example. A second example is that among the B Corps of Chile, the question of gap, the income gap, is something very normal. What kind of income gap you want to have in your company? Yes, what happened last year? Let me just finish. What happened last year with the disruption, the social disruption, was that only 3 companies decided to offer to the other companies in Chile, if they wanted to have a policy of maximum 10 times between the lower incomes and the higher incomes. And it's called 10 times 1. And now that expanded to thousands. See? So it's a citizen movement that uses the force of the markets to actually achieve the goals of society and the environment. New Zealand, Iceland, and Scotland have adopted 2 elements which are amazing. One, which is the well-being budget that elevates the different societal needs depending on the context, and actually measures all the budget according to the achievement of those big goals. Just imagine the commons becoming one of those huge goals of a budget. The same happens with the index, the well-being index. So, overcoming the traditional GDP index. So there
you're talking about a particular index that is called the well-being index?
That's right. Already in 3 countries.
Could you, elaborate on that, please? Well,
it goes beyond just, the GDP. It includes the GDP, but it includes the different societal needs, if you want, as the big indicators of progress. It's redefining success, you see, of a society. And now Costa Rica is considering the same. And this is expanding. The well-being index includes a lot of the Bhutan experience of the happiness index as well. But it's elaborated, and now the government of Scotland is leading the promotion of this index, and probably Wales will be the next one, and Costa Rica. But just imagine regeneration getting into the well-being index in a specific given country, because every single country defines its well-being. It's not like a rigid, static, like universal index. So depending on the region, depending on the country, those big indicators vary. Likewise with the budget. And now I also wanted to mention something especially to Vandana. There's a huge group, Danone, that actually last year convened another 18 companies, the traditional companies that have committed during the climate week to start moving towards regenerative agriculture. And they do include, they associate regenerative agriculture with smallholders and small producers and being owners of their own land. What would you think of an initiative like that? When you speak with the collaborators of Danone, of any of the companies, you see that they're learning a hell of a lot of how to actually do the regeneration with people and building trust and being like an instrument for exactly that movement to grow. What's your sense about an initiative like that?
I think the more we shift away from industrial agriculture, the more healthy we'll make the planet, the healthier will be the people. And yes, I welcome the fact that some of these large companies are shifting to regenerative with small farmers. For me, because I work so much on the food issue, I have watched in my lifetime how organic food was the normal food. It was the norm. Then industrial agriculture was subsidized and subsidized and subsidized globally, $400 billion. Made very costly food cheap. And then if you look at how the economy of GDP as an extractive measure, the definition of GDP is if you produce what you consume, you don't produce. That's how this, and it was created during the war. It was to extract more social wealth out of society to militarism. So I think it's high time to shed the GDP. But not only have we now reduced 1 billion people to hunger, 2 billion people to sickness. And I gave the figures earlier, 130 million to starvation with this thing if we don't sort it out. I definitely think we need to have a joint move, that the companies should shift to regeneration, but communities should reclaim the commons. And, you know, I'm waiting for the day where people do what was done in our movement of freedom, where, you know, the British had created large land holdings because they were in an extractive economy and they could extract more if they were bigger landlords. So they basically grabbed the land. In India, land could not be owned, it could be used. Your title was for use, not for buying and selling. Turning land into a commodity was part of the British Empire. And what they basically did, along with the whole, with the growth of industrial agriculture, the subsidies, is that small farmers have got deeper and deeper into debt. When I used to come to France in the early days, you had so many small farmers. And I remember fighting with the French government against the GATT rules on agriculture, 1993, before there was a WTO. And the land holdings have become bigger, but not in the hands of individuals. I have a book called Who Really Feeds the World, which I did for the expo in Milan. About 70% of the land in America is owned by the banks and financial institutions. And the original farmers who become tractor drivers pay a lease to these people who got them into the debt in the first place. And now they're thinking of driverless tractors, so they won't even need that. And I keep saying, so where will you get your rents from? Where will you get your extraction from? You can't get it out of a robot. So they haven't thought through their mechanistic unfolding of the inclusion of the commons to the end. So I really am worried about a world where even today, if you look at the lines for people for food in America, in England, yeah, that we have to reclaim food as a commons. We have to reclaim the cultivation of food as a commons. So yes, the companies can do what they do and shift their push for industrial agriculture. But we as communities, you know, I agree with Michel. I've always said the state and the market aren't the only players. People, society, community in cohesion are the biggest movers of society, particularly in crisis like this, where it is a crisis of survival. It's a crisis of whether will we live or we won't live, and who live, who won't live. So I think access of the best healthy food to the last person is where we must innovate. That is where public procurement. It's not that governments don't spend money on feeding the poor, but they feed junk food to the poor. They feed rotten poor food to the poor. If we decentralized public procurement and ensured that local community systems hook to the vulnerable who can't buy, you know, of course we need these solidarities between those who can buy and those who grow. A big number of those who can't buy. But then society has to mobilize the public resources, of which there are huge amounts, away from disease-eating in that food. Yeah? Because we need to see good food as a prevention of diabetes, a prevention of cancer. Pesticide-free food is an avoidance of cancer. We need to shift that, and those are the things that we need to start doing in another audit. And it, you know, it was the Bhutan king who said, when they asked him, so what will be your model of development, when he got off the flight from the non-aligned movement? And he said, I don't want to go the way of the West. I see very depressed people. I see very unhappy people. My duty is to maximize the happiness of my people. So basically, Bhutan gave up GDP and GNP and moved to gross national happiness. And out of this have come all the well-being ideas. And after this huge crisis, we will have a clear, naked, brutal choice: throw away people or well-being for all. And the governments that are able to make the leap and citizens who are able to work with their institutions to make the leap will have a future. And otherwise, we are going to see riots all over the place, as happening in America right now.
Yes. I would like Vandana to think about a question that you would like to ask any of the other gentlemen, and in the meantime I would like to take a moment to explain the word regeneration, or regenerative systems has been mentioned several times. And I think really that's at the heart of what we're saying and what is a lot of your work. Regeneration is intrinsic to living systems, being a cell, an organism, or an ecosystem. And it opposes the dominant view, which is mechanistic or linear, where everything is predictable or controllable, like the movement of a clock. So regeneration is the ability of an entity to recover. It's like in a garden, you get more out of it than what you put in. It's the metabolism that is intrinsic to life. And some schools of thinking have understood that this is a way of generating happiness, well-being, and wealth. I think that this is at the heart of the alternative proposals that are given here today. Vandana, what can you share about this?
So, we started the regeneration movement when we realized it wasn't enough to grow organic food. We have a system that's degrading the planet, degrading people's health. It is degrading democracy. It's not allowing people to make choices about what will you eat. Constantly there's cheating on labeling, there's cheating on what's safe and what's not safe. It's not just degenerating the planet and our health and democracy, it is leading to a degenerative economy where not the economy of the earth and nature and the economy of society are both going down, while the billions accumulated on the top are increasing. So for us, regeneration was never only about an agriculture method. It was about living systems. And the most important part today is we are part of the living systems. We are living systems. That's what my critique of the patent is. How can you take autonomous sovereign beings who make their choices and turn us into your mind and into your users? So regenerating the self-organizing capacity and interconnectedness and the density of relationships. My ecological research has shown that the more dense the relationships, which happens through diversity, the system is more resilient, but it produces more. So when there's more dense interactions in the soil between organisms, you have more soil fertility. Then you have more crops in the field. You have more nutrition per acre. When you have more plants, you have more insect diversity. And you don't ever have to spray, you never have to use poisons. Per unit, your nutrition is much higher. And therefore, we measure health per acre and not yield per acre. We measure true wealth and well-being per acre and not this extractive measure of commodity production, which is very, very deceitful. And we've done many, many reports, but it's basically higher and higher cost of production, lower and lower price of commodities, farmers getting squeezed out, eventually no farmers, real food will become very costly, fake food will become force-fed to people, and our tax money will move to that. So we've got to manage our tax system as a commons for the common good, not for the new subsidy for the next toxic diet. So regeneration for me is regenerating the economy to living economies, regenerating democracy to living democracies, regenerating culture to living cultures, regenerating the earth, regenerating our health. And this is what the subject of my book, Earth Democracy, is. And it was triggered by the WTO Seattle collapse, where they kept saying, the anti-globalization movement knows what it's against. They don't know what it's for. I said, we know what we are for. That's why we don't want you to commodify everything and turn everything into your property. Our world is not for sale. That is why commons is the way to begin to reclaim whatever has been taken away from us. It would be very, very nice to both hear from Pedro and Michel, where in a broader picture of regenerating democracy, the economy, and our humanity, where do we move with the commons? Where do we move with other values?
I'm going to try to directly address the question. So when I studied the open source and what I call peer production movements, what I saw was a completely different value system. So in these communities, the value is contribution. It's not commodity labor. So they are based, they're open collaborative systems where people can come in and out as they wish, and contribute to the common project. So this is a move from a commodity the value economy to a contributive economy, and the recognition of all contributions, not just market contributions. So that's where the value comes from in these types of new commons-oriented economies. And so what you see is that then these people who come together to create common value, they say, okay, how can we live from this? How can we make a living and an ethical livelihood around our contributions? And so they're going to design markets which are not capitalist extractive markets, but they are generative markets. What kind of market exchange can work for us? So you look at, for example, community-supported agriculture. You know, they use some kind of market exchange because consumers are still paying for the organic food, but it's based on an ethical arrangement in the ecosystem as a whole. So this is interesting because it's already transforms from a market-centric economy and society to a common-centric, which designs its economy around its commons. And then you have a remaining issue, which is the state. And what you see in these communities is that they create what I call for-benefit associations. So if you look at the open source communities and the urban commons, they will eventually create some kind of entity that manages the infrastructure of cooperation on behalf of the whole ecosystem. These are not all-styled NGOs, which says, okay, well, here's a problem, let's look for resources and then direct the resources. These are platforms for cooperation. They say, okay, what do we need to do so that these people can cooperate, in the long run? And this is my vision of the state. So what you get is an enabling, empowering common good institution, which is there to stimulate the commons of capabilities of the whole population. Make sure that everybody can contribute in these projects. Now, Vandana also mentioned something in passing that I think is very important. I think you said taxation as a commons. I think you said that. And there is a very interesting movement in Europe, which is called the economy of the common good. And this is from an Austrian man who used to be in attack, that he looked at all the European constitutions and he said, you know what? There's not a single constitution that says that the economy should serve private shareholders. They all say the same thing, the economy should serve the common good. And then his second step was, well, the common good is actually not a metaphysical concept, it's something we can agree on democratically. So we can actually get people together and have them talk together about what is the common good. And so they eventually developed this accounting system, an impact accounting system with 17 clusters of positive and negative impact. Now imagine this, what if the governments decide to tax based on this impact, right? You don't even have to change the entities, because of course corporations have some kind of, predatory DNA built in, but you just tell them from now on, if you produce negative impact, you'll pay more taxes and you get less subsidies. And if you produce positive impact, you'll pay less taxes and get more support from society. Think about this. I think this is a very good idea because it would completely transform the incentive base of our whole society. It's kind of like outside in reform. I just want to finish now with something that I think is very important, which I find very important, and is a big part of my work. I don't have the opportunity like Vandana to work, around food directly or seed commons. I'm a librarian, so that's a bit of a limitation.
Commons also.
But what I find absolutely crucial is that people have to know that alternatives exist. Most people that I know just don't know that they exist. And so if your vision of life is determined by finding a job at all costs and do whatever then these people tell you to do, you cannot change anything. You can only change if you realize that there is a different way. So I think that, of course, Vandana is doing this, and I don't know Pedro very well, but I'm sure he's doing it, is that the first thing that we need to do is actually spread information, spread the knowledge that there are seed forms already there that kind of exemplify potential futures. If they exist in seed form, that allows us to imagine what a kind of society would exist if these seed forms would be the norm. And I think what Vandana said is very important, about organic food, but you can apply it all over the board, is that today the generative is the exception and the extractive is the norm, right? We have to change the polarity, and I don't think we can have zero extraction, but we can make regenerative the core of the next civilization.
Actually, we are in an opportunity because governments, I think throughout the world, are now thinking about their rescue and recovery, economic recovery policies and norms. So it's time is ripe for the different movements of reinventing our economy to come up with very, very concrete initiatives. The one that Michel just mentioned is something which is being spoken throughout the world. I mean, how we turn the financial accounting system universally into a triple impact accounting system, and that would be the basis for governments to know where you do the taxing and where actually a company creates value for society and for the planet. That's one. A second element would be, a second proposal for me crucial, is what France did with Loi Pacte, to elevate for the large companies the purpose. So it's relocated profit behind solutions. And also the third element is to challenge the logic of fiduciary liability, maximization of the shareholders' interests beyond any of the other groups of people with whom a company is associated. The expansion of that clause, it has a tremendous impact throughout the world. The expansion from shareholders' interest to stakeholders' interest, and to be able to enable companies to balance the different interests at the managerial level and also at the board level, and manage also the long-term needs of the planet and of the people. My sense is that, to be very direct, I think we have been creating a system that has subsidized COVID. I mean, the system, as Vandana was saying, forced us, everybody, to be part of, global warming, loss of biodiversity, the loss of community, the sense of community, or the web of community, and we need to revert that. And for that, we need to find the mutation points of the economic system, and that's both at the micro level as well as the macro level.
Wrapping up an hour and a half of interesting sharing is at the heart, we see the importance of understanding that there all are alternatives. So we have captured a better understanding of what are considered to be, profound issues and profound problems, and therefore solutions in terms of independence of seeds, the presence of the commons, and the importance and the capacity of when different people come together to create value, that really is very much captured in the commons, that there are alternative ways of doing business, and there are alternative ways of seeing the economy, and that not so long ago a lot of other alternatives existed. So it's we have seen here and shared in this conversation what they are and why they are important, sharing the different stories also to see that there are examples sometimes very close to where we are, and also very close to our daily lives. Essential being small scale in the sense of decentralizing production in a large sense, whether it's food or others, this is something that will strengthen the regenerative capacity of a system. And I think it's really important for you to have been able to share and to exchange these thoughts here with us. We will be inviting also a lot of other speakers on other events that will also be touching about regenerative in different ways, a systems approach of life. And we invite you to also tap into those and help us, as we will help you indeed make sure that a lot of people get inspired by your work, that a lot of people get inspired about these dialogues and about the exchange that has taken place, and also understand for themselves. Every individual is different. We've seen that during the lockdown. We've also seen that during the lockdown, things that are important are not buyable. That has been very visible, whether you were in a house in a city or in the other part of the world, and to make sure that people also start to understand the alternatives they have for their own life, because everybody does. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Camila. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Lovely to be with all of you. Thank you so much.
Nice speaking to Michel and Pedro again. Yeah.